Right, got a screw on the top there and a screwdriver made to engage with that. Let's just see if I can get this to stay in one place. Where's my lock lever? Let's drop that back in place and use that to hold this from turning, which is there. Now the screwdriver has just been modified to leave me with 2 spurs, so it engages with that screw. All of these parts are very, very sticky. The grease is just dried out to a very sticky, thick, waxy sort of a base. It's, you know, almost like treacle. Oh. Move these screws. This is the pull that stops the film advance from rolling backwards. I'll just remove this spring. And put that with the other springs out of this harm's way. This screw, it's got a shoulder on the top. This acts as a support for the shutter cocking rack. Helps to keep the shutter cocking rack in firm contact with the gear that's on the top of the film advance. I want to get this rewind button off the bottom of the camera, so I've got to find the right tool. The right tool is here. It's a pair of pliers that have been modified to grip that button. So just unscrew that, the button, and its washer can go into the cleaning. The spring goes away to one side. A single screw here drives the sprocket, film sprocket, from the sprocket shaft. We'll recover that, pop the shaft out. There's our shaft, and that allowed the bush from the top of the film advance to fall out, so we'll have that out. And here's the clutch. The clutch is 3 pieces. So there's a spring there coupling the inner and outer. It's a friction clutch. At the base, well, I'll unhook that spring at the base, and that is holds the lever, and the lever's job is to lock the rewind button in place when you press the rewind button in, until such stage as you move the film advance again, which swings that lever across and frees up the button. Drops it back into place, allows the button to drop down, and that pulls the gear on the sprocket shaft down into engagement with the film advance again. Let's remove those 3 screws from the base, and these 3 screws hold this bush on the shaft to the camera body. That's all very sticky. I'll pop them to one side. I can remove the take-up spool from the back, and the bush is brass, and I want to clean that in the ultrasonic. The plastic spool I will clean manually. And the camera body is starting to get a little bit stripped down now, which is all to the good. So the hinge screws for the front. One on the base, one on the top. There is probably also at least one shim washer between the door and the body. I can't see any on the door. They're usually sticking to something. Well, there's one at the base, and another one at the top. There are two shim washers. If the shim washers are missing, the door will have a vertical rattle up and down, which is undesirable. It doesn't really make a lot of difference to the way the camera functions, but you don't want things rattling, it doesn't feel right. So the camera body, that's fairly well stripped down there. I've got to remove the shutter from the camera body, and that's held in place with a retaining ring. It's a special tool to do that on the Retinas. The retaining ring is quite hard to get at because it's buried down deep around the outside of the rear lens grip. So this is a Belgian tool. Used to be able to get them on eBay. Unfortunately, Mr. Belgian is no longer making them, but it was a very good thing to have. Better on the Retina 1A and 2A in particular, and the 2s than the 3C type because it just fitted better. But it was certainly a good commercially available spanner. This one here is a spanner that was made specially for me. I was given this by another Kodak Retina repairer. He'd had one made for himself and he had one made for me. This is a nicely made tool, does exactly the same job. It's got slightly more clearance on the inside here, which means it fits around the rear lens group on a 3C a little bit better than that other tool. But basically in use, these are just carefully fitted down into position and they engage with the slotted retainer ring on the back of the shutter. They're usually quite tight. If they're not tight, they've got a nasty habit of rattling loose. That should be loose. Now the shutter will lift away. This is the retaining ring. You can see it's got a small notch either side, you can see it there, which will engage with the tool like this. The tool has to be able to fit down around the rear grip, and you can see the problem here because this does not want to go over that rear grip, whereas the other tool clears it nicely. There wouldn't be much in that. I mean, you're talking very small small distances indeed, but it's enough to cause a problem. There's nothing particularly unusual looking about that shutter. I happen to know it's a bit sticky and reluctant to move. It'll just require servicing, which of course I'll be doing. So let's carry on with the body. What needs to come off? Well, this is the coupling here that runs through to this screw you see at the top. That's the rangefinder coupling. So that screw runs in the slot at the top there, and that needs to come out. That's on a hinged arm, as you'll see shortly when I get that thing out there. And it's hinged so that when the camera is folded and this slides back into the body, that arm can't just go straight back, it would have nowhere to go. It actually runs away down a track. So I'll remove these two screws that hold the plate on the front here, and here's the coupling arm, and as you can see it's hinged at that point. This chrome shroud covers the gear, or supports the gear that drives the shutter, cocks the shutter with the action of the shutter cocking rack. there's the gear, which forms the front half of that shaft. What I need to do now is mark the relative positions of the focus scale ring here in black with the outer helical here, which is the bright brass piece, and mark the position of the inner helical, the dark brass piece, with the outer helical. So I usually scribe a line across that. I like to do it when all the surfaces are level. So I want the inner and outer helical level with each other. And they are at that point. So taking a sharp tool, I just scribe a line across there. I put 2 lines at the base of the camera and 1 line more or less opposite at the top of the camera. That allows me to get all 3 components correctly assembled in the correct positions relative to each other. Now I can see here there's another repairer's alignment mark at this point, and probably that alignment mark was made in the same way, but their reference might have been slightly different than mine. It's not uncommon for people to choose to put their reference lines when the focus is set at the infinity position, for example. I find it more useful to set it when the front, inner and outer helical are dead level with each other, which you can measure with a rule. So that's done. What do we got here? So we've got 4 nickel plated countersunk head screws, or flathead screws, depending on which part of the world you come from. They hold this retaining ring in place. These screws are all quite small, and like all small screws, they're very easily lost. It would not be uncommon for me to have to go to my spare parts bin and find stray screws to replace them in the course of a repair. So that's the retaining ring off. There are 4 black screws here which pass through the mount and couple to the plate in the front of the bellows. So they hold the front of the bellows to the back of this front standard. So I'll see if I can remove those. All of these parts are very sticky with dirty old grease and dust. The inner helical and the outer helical should come out now. You'll see that the inner helical runs on 2 rails. They stop the inner helical from rotating. So as the outer helical is rotated, it means the inner helical just moves forward or backwards on those rails. These parts can come apart. The focus is very sticky. That grease is nasty. 4 nickel plated rounded head screws hold the focus mount here onto the front standard. So we'll have those off. Take out that piece. Now the bellows here have come away from the back of the front standard because they're no longer being held by the screws, so they fall back into the body. There are 4 screws hold this whole mechanism, this sliding mechanism, into the body. 2 at the top and 2 at the base here and here. There's a 5th screw here which holds the bracket which supports the transfer shaft. So I'll remove that first. It's a very small round-headed screw, quite short, unusually short. And these 4 screws, 2 at the top and 2 at the bottom. Well, the ones at the bottom are usually hardest to remove because they're usually stuck in fairly well from having the leatherette stuck on them, and also a measure of corrosion typically. So I'm just trying them to see if they're going to come loose for me. You can see I'm using two hands on that screwdriver and it's still not doing anything useful for me. And at the top of the camera, yeah, they're coming loose. Keep a lot of downward pressure on the screwdriver to make sure it doesn't slip in the screw slot. So two of the screws are loose, two of them are not. Well, I can put a little drop of naphtha on there. That may help a little bit, but most likely I'm going to have to use brute force. Here's the most important tool in anyone's toolkit. So these two screws, well, I'm going to use an old screwdriver and I'm going to use it as an impact driver. I'm applying a lot of torque between finger and thumb on that screwdriver and I'm going to tap it on the top. Couple of sharp taps and check, and that screw's coming loose. Don't overdo that because it's easy to actually push in the body. If you knock the casting in, everything becomes tight at the front when the sliding sections won't move smoothly. So a light, sharp rap is what's wanted. If you bash it too hard, it won't go well for you. Right, out with that. Here's the shaft that couples to the cocking rack at the back of that gear, and the flats on here drive that front gear, which in turn cocks the shutter when you move the film advance. So we have our body casting stripped out. That all needs to be cleaned. I can see a little bit of dust in there, a bit of dried grease. It's not a terrible example by any means, but it certainly needs some cleaning up. And here we have the front sliding section. This little piece here, which I'm just going to drop out, that's part of the shutter release. The shutter release shaft pushes on this, which then pushes on this finger, and that finger pushes on the shutter release lever here on the shutter. And it needs to be as complicated as that because this piece needs to be able to slide in out of the way. So getting this apart, I'm just pushing in the buttons top and bottom and then catching them with between finger and thumb as I slide it out the back so that the buttons don't spring away into the distance, and taking the springs with them. There's the two springs. The buttons can go into my growing pile of parts for the degreaser. And this piece here, this is our front standard. There's that shutter release finger I mentioned. There's a spring here which returns it. Depending on the camera, it may or may not have a spring in that position. Only the very earliest ones had no spring there. The cameras had, some cameras had a spring under the shutter release shaft in the body, and other cameras did not. The earliest cameras, I'm not even sure now, there was a mixture. There was a mixture of features used. Some cameras had two springs, some cameras had one spring. Probably depended on how many bad cameras had come back into the service department with sticky shutter releases as to how enthusiastic they were with the number of springs they used and which ones they used them. Right, so there's our parts ready to go. Some of these parts need to be cleaned by hand, these parts, and the camera front of course. These parts, this, and the top, which I haven't disassembled yet, that's a whole thing all of its own. These parts, that'll just clean in the ultrasonic cleaner. This, I'll want to clean that with some solvent, probably acetone, possibly something else as well, to get rid of that old adhesive and stuff that's stuck on the base. because I want the leatherette to stick down fairly well. On the base of the camera, there's a limited amount of cleaning I can do on this because I do not want to damage that piece of leatherette. That's the piece that was stuck on the bottom and has remained there. And when I glue the leatherette back down, when the job is all finished, that blemish will disappear, just as long as I don't lose that piece. We've got damaged leatherette at this point, and I can see cracks through it at that point. Those cracks will disappear when that's glued down. That will have to be filled with a bit of black wax, I think. That leatherette is just old and dry.